speak to you in the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. You may be seated. If you can remember Matthew's Gospel from 2 weeks ago, the disciples and Jesus are at the temple in Jerusalem, and Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. And the disciples naturally ask when these things will happen. And in today's Gospel, Jesus actually answers their question, although not in the way that the disciples want him to. Jesus says, about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And Jesus goes on to describe how no one knows when God will come again. While the disciples seek and want predictions about when these things will happen, that's not what Jesus is doing in today's gospel passage. Instead of telling people what to expect or when God will come, Jesus describes what we do while we wait for the coming of God, especially when the waiting gets difficult and times are hard. The passage in today's gospel about two being in a field, one being taken and one being left, and two women grinding flour, one taken, one left, has been used to describe rapture theology, which is a form of dispensationalism, a belief in a historical plan that God has for human salvation, which is enacted in stages or dispensations. Just as it is tempting for the disciples to seek signs about what is to come, dispensational and rapture theology falls into the same trap. And I get where this is tempting to believe. Sometimes I think it would be much easier, my friends, if God would just take us up to heaven so we could avoid the responsibility of fixing the brokenness of the world. Just being taken up to heaven would mean we would no longer have to deal with the waiting and the trials and tribulations of this life. But instead, Jesus says simply that we wait with the same level of expectation that God might arrive at any moment. We are called to wait for the coming of God in hope and expectation, and that what we do while we wait is to be colored by that hope and expectation. We persevere in faith because we have hope in God's promise to us. That's what will get us through the difficult times as well as the good ones. Now, I have to be honest with you. When I hear Jesus say, "Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming," I sometimes feel like Jesus is calling us to a state of constant vigilance that sounds absolutely exhausting. Looking over your shoulder every moment, walking on eggshells, concerned that God will swoop in and take you or your loved ones away. That couldn't be more different from what Jesus means in today's gospel. Instead of the call to keep awake as a call to constant fearful vigilance, we are called instead to a hopeful expectation that God is in the world and coming into the world, both now and in the time to come. We know that this is what Jesus means because shortly after today's gospel conversation with his disciples, Jesus himself is about to suffer and die on the cross. And what Jesus knows and tells his disciples, although they do not yet realize it, is that out of that suffering and death will come resurrection and new life. And so we wait in hope and in trust, not in fear and despair, for the coming of God, because that's how the power of God works in the world. Where we may see death and destruction, God is bringing about life and renewal. When we are tempted to fall into despair, God calls us to wait in hope. There's a reason why the lectionary pairs today's gospel reading of waiting and hope with our beautiful first reading from the prophet Isaiah. It's difficult for modern Western Christians to imagine the scope of the suffering of God's people at the time that Isaiah spoke these words. The relative prosperity and peace that the nations of Israel and Judah experienced during the early 8th century BC were a distant memory by the time of Isaiah. Instead, the relentless advances of the Assyrian Empire had decimated the nation of Israel. Many Israelites had escaped Assyria's invasion of their homes and sought refuge in Judah and its capital city, Jerusalem. And yet, Jerusalem is soon attacked by the Assyrians, and the city endured the hardships of a prolonged military siege. People were literally starving to death within the city walls. And against this backdrop of suffering, anxiety, and imminent conquest, Isaiah announces that he has received a vision concerning God's perspective about Judah and Jerusalem. And this prophetic vision, like many in the Hebrew Bible, promises a future that directly contradicts the people's present experiences. While the opening lines of Isaiah's prophecy, "in the days to come," is often translated as "in the last days," and thus can imply an eschatological or end-time setting, the Hebrew does not actually say the end times. It just says, "in the future," a hopeful time promised amid a difficult present. Instead of people flocking to Jerusalem seeking refuge from an imperial enemy, people will flock to Jerusalem as a haven of God's wisdom and justice. Instead of huddling within the city walls in fear, the love and justice of God will stream forth, bringing peace to all the world. Instead of a world ravaged by war and conflict, the world will flourish and prosper, and instruments of war will be turned into tools for growing things, bringing new life instead of death and destruction. I can't imagine what kind of hope and persistence in the face of hardship Isaiah's words must have brought to the ravaged citizens of Jerusalem. But I do know the kind of hope and assurance that I feel when I reflect on what God has done in my own life, most especially in the difficult times. There have been dark and hard times in my life when I couldn't even imagine the future. And yet, looking back, I see that God was working in my life and in the world the whole time. And I remember once again that it is life and hope that God brings into the world, now in our difficult present circumstances as much as in the time to come. And this is what Jesus promises to his disciples today. The Son of Man is both coming and is already here, and we wait in hope and joyful expectation, not in fear or in despair. And while we wait, we can see and sense what God is already bringing into being in our midst. Many of us were able to gather together with friends and family this Thanksgiving in ways that we have not been able to for the past few years. Even 2 years ago, we could not have imagined what it would feel like to gather together again. We have the ability, my friends, through our giving tree to bring warmth to children who are cold. This year we'll be donating hats, mittens, and coats for the community of Episcopalians at St. Nicholas in Richfield. Someone whose hands would have been cold will instead be warm and safe this winter. People who are hungry are fed through our shared ministry with the open cupboard and loaves and fishes. I could go on, because the more that you start looking for what God is doing in the world, the more you see it. As difficult and uncertain as many of our present circumstances are, we have the assurance of God's presence with us, bringing beautiful futures into being. These beautiful futures are brought into being now, and will continue to be brought into being in the time to come. All we are asked to do as people of faith is to see and to trust and to live into what God is doing in the world. Keep awake to God's presence in our midst.